have, we probably have a lot of people not coming on because of they don't have power.
That's no excuse.
And
I'm doing this on my cell phone.
See, I told you, not having power is no excuse. You have a cell phone.
yeah, unless you can't charge your cell phone.
They warned you to do that beforehand.
Anyway, yeah, I think let's get started. And we all got the email message that Jim Bailey passed away. Jim was, aside from being a member of our group, was Jack Austin's brother-in-law, and Jack brought him in a couple of years ago. And I know he enjoyed coming to our meetings, and he'll be missed. So just, we give a moment of silence in honor of Jim.
Yeah.
But
Okay, I think we kicked around the storm. Hopefully, other than power outages, everybody else, that made it through the storm safely.
You didn't get out of here.
I'm sorry, somebody say something? So, everybody made it through, safely. That's the main concern. Everything else can be fixed or replaced as needed. And I don't really have any announcements other than there is a mask. I assume they're going to go through with it. They've scheduled mask giveaways from 10 to 2 every Thursday, at least for the month of August, at Rippewam High School. So, you haven't heard anything other than on that, Steve?
oh,
Okay.
Phil's trying to say something, but he's muted. Looks like.
Who?
Phil looks like he's moving his mouth like he wants to talk to us, but he's muted. There you go. Whoop. Still.
So you got to unmute yourself.
Does
Anybody know how to read lips?
there you go.
All right. Oh. His microphone's not working.
We can't hear you, Phil.
Something's not working. It's on your end, Phil.
Whoops. No, you just muted yourself again.
Microphone plugged in.
Oh, you're unmuted, but we still can't hear you.
You're going to have to hold up a big poster
I've
board.
got to leave for a second, guys.
Maybe Phil. Maybe you should just try to lock him back in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it looks like he's going to do. Then we'll hear him,
Yeah.
hopefully.
Yep.
Anybody else have any commentary to make or anything new or exciting happening?
Nothing much.
Down in the Chopin area where I am, it didn't seem to do very much damage.
Yeah.
Aside from the front page of the Advocate.
Now there are a lot of trees down the west side. I was out a little yesterday.
Yeah. We didn't have a whole lot of wind, almost no rain, and then the sun came out.
I hope he gets back on. We're all waiting. Ah, there he goes. Let's see if he gets that sound this time. Hey, Phil, unmute yourself. No, you're muted again.
Yeah.
No, wait, we heard you.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. Bob Budke is getting married on the 22nd of this month to Maria. And this has been a postponed event. And of course, we wish him all the best.
Where is he getting married?
I don't know where,
Oh.
but I know when.
Oh, just the place.
The 22nd.
Oh, my birthday. Okay.
Oh, happy birthday to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wedding gifts can be mailed to.
Stu, thank you for realizing that I was trying to get on.
No problem.
Big struggle.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know. Joe had to go away for a few minutes here. We can either sit here and wait for him, or if you want me, I can start the presentation today.
How long is the presentation?
Didn't look at the whole thing, so I don't know. I mean, we'll be able to cut some of it out, which is the question and answer, which we don't have part to, so then we can discuss it ourselves. Shall I start the presentation then?
Might as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think so.
Sounds good to me.
Oh, please.
Hopefully it'll work all right.
Remind us what's it about?
American democracy in crisis.
Oh.
At the end of the talk, I will review the questions and read them to our speaker and ask him to respond. And now
Are you seeing it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
on to our speaker for the day. Stephen R. Levitsky is perhaps best known to the general public as co-author with Daniel Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, published in 2018, which was a New York Times bestseller. Today, he will talk about why he believes American democracy has fallen into crisis over the last decade, scenarios for how democracy in the future might be seriously compromised or even ended, and what steps we can take to prevent these possible outcomes. Professor Levitsky is a noted comparative political scientist focusing on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions, mostly in Latin America. He is the author or co-author of over half a dozen books in this area. Dr. Levitsky is David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies, Professor of Government, and he is Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. He has also written for the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Vox, The New Republic, and The Monkey Cage. And he has written regular columns in the Peruvian newspaper La República and the Brazilian newspaper Folha de Sao Paulo. Levitsky received a BA in political science from Stanford University in 1990 and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 1999. He's been on the faculty of the Harvard University since 2000. And now, Professor Levitsky, we are pleased to hear your talk. Take it from here.
Hi, everybody. I like that drawing the curtain back by putting my video on. So I'm first of all, I want to thank the Greenwich RMA and especially Steve Myers for inviting me. I really wish that I could have been there in person. That was the original plan. I really like being in the same room with people and spitting on them when I speak and the like. That's not going to happen today for a while. But I guess there are positives too. At least you can't throw tomatoes at me while I speak. So I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, and hopefully that'll give us some time for Q&A. We'll see how it goes. In any case, thanks very much for hearing me out. So democracies don't die the way they used to die. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns in military coups like we saw a lot of in South America in the 1960s and 1970s. Today, 50 years later, most democracies die in a much more subtle way. They die at the hands not of generals, but of elected leaders, elected presidents, prime ministers, who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. They use elections, they use referenda and plebiscites, they use laws, acts of parliament, they use Supreme Court rulings. This is Putin, it's Hugo Chavez, it's Erdogan in Turkey, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and many others. What's so dangerous, ultimately, about this electoral road to autocracy is that it happens behind a pretty credible facade of democracy. There are no tanks in the streets. Elections are still held. The Constitution remains intact. Congress often continues to function. And as a result, many citizens, particularly those who don't pay attention to politics day to day, are really not aware of what's happening until it's too late. Now, Americans took an initial step down this road towards electoral autocracy when we elected a president with pretty clear authoritarian instincts in 2016, a man who had threatened to lock up his opponent and who threatened not to accept the results of the elections. But electing a demagogue president, though never a good idea, does not in any way condemn us to democratic breakdown. That is what our institutions are for. And Americans have a lot of faith in our institutions, have a lot of faith in our Constitution for pretty good reason. We've got the oldest and arguably the most successful Constitution on earth. Our Constitution has checked many powerful, many ambitious.
We lost the speaker.
Steve, you know, we thought we lost the
the
speaker.
speaker.
Steve?
Steve, you're muted also.
Steve, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. You lost it? That's crazy. Okay, hold on. Let me
Yeah, we did.
see if I can get it back here. You have the screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
By strong democratic norms, by unwritten rules. In our book, How Democracies Die, focuses on two norms in particular, two democratic norms. The first one is what we call mutual toleration. That is very simple, accepting the legitimacy of our partisan rivals. That means that no matter how much we may disagree with our rivals, no matter how much we may dislike our partisan rivals, we recognize both publicly and privately that they are loyal citizens who love the country as much as we do and who have an equal, legitimate right to be out there doing politics, to oppose us, to compete against us, and if they beat us in an election, an equal and legitimate right to govern us. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. Second norm is a little more complicated. It's what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of deliberate self-restraint and underutilization of one's power. We do not often think about forbearance in politics, but it is absolutely essential to any political system. Think about what the U.S. presidency or the U.S. president constitutionally, legally is able to do. The president, as you know, can pardon whomever she wants, whenever she wants. Any president with a majority in Congress can pack the Supreme Court. So if the president doesn't like the ideological composition of the court with a majority in Congress, they can expand it to 11 to 13 and fill it with allies. That is perfectly legal. The Constitution does not prohibit the president from bypassing Congress and making policies through executive orders or by declaring a national emergency. Again, totally constitutional. Or think about what Congress constitutionally, legally can do. Congress can shut down the government by refusing to fund it. The Senate can prevent the president from filling cabinet seats, from filling Supreme Court vacancies. And of course, the House can impeach the president really on any grounds that it chooses. My point here is that politicians can exploit the letter of the Constitution in ways that totally eviscerate the spirit of the Constitution. That's what court packing is: partisan impeachment, government shutdowns, national emergencies. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet, my colleague at Harvard, calls this behavior, this use of the letter of the law deliberately to subvert the spirit of the law, he calls that constitutional hardball. You look at any failing or any failed democracy in the world, and you will see an abundance of exactly this: constitutional hardball. Spain and Germany in the 1930s, Chile in the 1970s, contemporary Hungary, Poland, Venezuela, Turkey. What prevents a democracy like ours from descending into a destructive spiral of constitutional hardball is this thing that we call forbearance. It is a shared commitment among our politicians to institutional restraint, a commitment to not use the letter of the law to subvert its spirit. Two examples, historically. Think about presidential term limits in the United States. Prior to 1951, the United States placed no limits. The U.S. Constitution placed no limits on presidential reelection. So legally, prior to 1951, our leaders could be president for life, just like Hugo Chavez was in Venezuela, just like Daniel Ortega is in Nicaragua. But for nearly 150 years, following an informal precedent set by George Washington, no president of the United States sought a third term. It was not the Constitution that prevented ambitious, powerful presidents like Jefferson, Jackson, Grant from seeking a third term. It was a norm of forbearance. It was self-restraint. Second example, the Senate filibuster historically. Filibusters are a really powerful tool. The opposition can use the filibuster to block the president's every move in most cases, and it can often grind legislative activity to a halt. But for most of the 20th century, the filibuster, despite its great power, was very rarely used. Very few senators actually broke the glass and used it. The Senate recorded an average of one filibuster a year between 1917 and 1960. Senators exercised forbearance. These two norms, mutual toleration and forbearance, served as what Ziblatt and I call the soft guardrails of American democracy. They are what helped to prevent healthy, normal political competition from spiraling into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracies in Europe in the 1930s and in South America in the 1960s and 70s. Now, the U.S. has not always had these soft guardrails. It didn't have them in the 1790s when partisan warfare between the Federalists and the Republicans nearly destroyed the Republic before it could take hold. Whatever guardrails we had collapsed in the run-up to the Civil War, and they remained weak all the way through the end of Reconstruction. The 1860s and the 1870s were replete with constitutional hardball, changes to the size of the Supreme Court in 1866 and 1869, presidential impeachment in 1868, a contested and probably stolen election in 1876. Norms of mutual toleration and forbearance in this country didn't really take hold until the late 19th century. It's worth taking a second to think about why and how they took hold. Mutual toleration between the Republicans and the Democrats really only emerged after the Republicans gave up on the project of Reconstruction and allowed Democrats to establish Jim Crow in the South. Southern Democrats viewed the project of Reconstruction as an existential threat, a threat to their way of life, and they viewed its promoters, the radical Republicans, as bitter, dangerous enemies. And they fought like hell using both legal and illegal means against Reconstruction. It was only after the Republicans gave up on Reconstruction, after 1876, that the two parties began to peacefully coexist. In other words, it was only after racial equality was essentially taken off the political agenda and the political community was essentially restricted to whites that norms of mutual toleration and forbearance between the two parties really took hold. That's a point worth keeping in mind. Now, that said, norms of mutual toleration and forbearance were pretty strong in the United States throughout the 20th century. Democrats and Republicans for a good century accepted one another as legitimate rivals, and for the most part, they avoided destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. There were no impeachments, no court packings, no costly government shutdowns. Filibusters, as I noted, were rare. Supreme Court nominees were approved even when the opposition party controlled the Senate. So for more than a century, from the late 19th century to the late 20th century, our system of checks and balances worked pretty well. But again, the system worked because it was reinforced by norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. Those norms are now unraveling. There were signs of this unraveling in the 1990s. I think that's roughly when it began, particularly when Newt Gingrich began to encourage fellow Republicans to use language like betray, anti-flag, and traitor to describe Democrats, essentially encouraging Republicans to abandon the discourse of mutual toleration. Gingrich, as you know, is also a master of constitutional hardball. He invented the modern government shutdown in 1995, and in 1998, the House carried out the first presidential impeachment in 130 years. But the erosion of mutual toleration arguably really accelerated in the early part of the 21st century, especially during the Obama presidency. Republican leaders like Gingrich, Palin, Giuliani, Huckabee, Trump began to tell their followers during the Obama presidency that President Obama did not love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans, and that maybe President Obama himself was not an American citizen. One quote, Colorado Congressman Mike Kaufman, he declared in a private fundraiser, I quote, "I do not know if Barack Obama was born in the United States of America, but I do know this, that in his heart, he is not an American. He's just not an American." Now, the United States has always had an extremist fringe, but this was no longer fringe politics. National Republican leaders were beginning to deny the legitimacy or question the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals. That's a problem, because when mutual toleration disappears, politicians start to abandon forbearance. When we view our partisan rivals, the other guys, as our enemies, as an existential threat, we grow tempted to use any means necessary to stop them. And that is exactly what's happened in American politics over the last decade or so. After the 2010 Tea Party election, the Republican in Congress treated the Obama administration as an existential threat that had to be defeated at any cost. So it played hardball. There were more filibusters during President Obama's second term than in all the years between World War I and Reagan's second term combined. Congress twice shut down the government, at one point pushing the country to the brink of default. President Obama responded with constitutional hardball of his own. When Congress refused to pass immigration legislation or climate change legislation to his liking, he circumvented Congress and made policy via executive orders. That action was technically legal, but it clearly violated the spirit of the Constitution. I'm starting to spit. I'm spitting onto my screen, though, rather than you. But the most stunning act of constitutional hardball of all during the Obama years was the Senate's decision in 2016 not to allow President Obama to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by Justice Scalia's death. That move, not just voting down a nominee, but not permitting the president to fill a vacancy, had not been done since 1866. All that stuff I just mentioned happened before Donald Trump became president. So the problem is not that Americans just elected a demagogue as president. The problem is that we elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy were becoming unmoored. So why is this happening? Why is it happening now? Over the last 25 years or so, our norms have eroded because of deepening political polarization. Over the last 25, 30 years, Republicans and Democrats have quite literally come to fear and loathe one another. Back in 1960, there was a survey, I don't think it was a very good survey, but a survey found that 4% of Democrats and 5% of Republicans said they would be displeased if their kid married someone from another party. Almost nobody. Today, that number is nearly 50%. According to a recent Pew survey, I think from 2 years ago, 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats say the other party makes them afraid. Another survey found that 60% of both Democrats and Republicans say the other party is a danger to the United States. We have not seen that level of partisan hatred since Reconstruction. Now, this is not just traditional liberal conservative polarization. People do not fear and loathe one another over taxes and health care. Today's partisan differences run much deeper. They're about race and culture, racial and cultural identity. Our partisan identities, the names of the parties have remained obviously the same over the last 50 years, but our partisan identities have changed dramatically. If you go back 50 years, 1960s, 1970s, the Democrats and Republicans had different positions on various policies, but they were culturally and demographically very similar. In short, both parties were overwhelmingly white and Christian. 3 changes have happened over the last half century, over our lifetimes. First of all, the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, while African Americans, in many cases newly enfranchised, became increasingly Democrats. Secondly, the United States experienced a massive wave of immigration, first from Latin America, then from Asia. Most of those immigrants and their kids, to the extent that they have become citizens and voters, have become Democrats. And third, under Reagan, evangelical Christians flocked to the Republican Party. If you go back to the late 1970s, evangelicals were evenly distributed between the two parties. They were actually under Carter slightly more Democrat than Republican, but since Reagan, evangelicals have been overwhelmingly Republican. So today, Democrats and Republicans represent very distinct communities. The Democrats are sort of a rainbow coalition of urban educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities. Nearly half of the Democratic Party electorate is non-white. And Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and Christian. So what? Why does that matter? It matters because white Christians are not just any group. Not only were they once an overwhelming electoral majority, but they occupied the top rung of virtually all of our country's political, economic, social, and cultural hierarchy. They filled the presidency, they filled the Congress, they filled the Supreme Court, the governor's mansions. They were the CEOs, they were the newscasters, they were the experts, they were the pillars of local communities. Those days, and they were also the face of both the Democratic and Republican parties. Those days obviously are long gone. But losing a majority, and more importantly, losing one's dominant social status, can be deeply threatening. Many Republican voters, not all Republican voters, many Republican voters feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that, for them, for many, feels like an existential threat. That, we argue, is what fuels the radicalization of the Republican Party and the polarization of our politics. The problem is that polarization can kill democracy. Research by Yale political scientist Milan Svolik shows that the more polarized a society is, the more we become willing to tolerate undemocratic or norm-breaking behavior by our own side. So when politics is so polarized that we view a victory by our rivals as something that's catastrophic, as something that's intolerable, we start to justify in our own heads, it's using extraordinary means to prevent the other guys from winning. Things from voter suppression to election fraud to violence and coups. Now, Americans have not reached the point of violence and coups. But we have reached a point where, according to exit polls in 2016, 1 out of 4 Trump voters said they believed that Donald Trump was unfit for the office of the presidency. 1 out of 4 people who pulled a lever for Donald Trump believed that the man was not fit for the office of the presidency. And yet they still preferred him to the Democrat. We've reached a point where, according to Gallup polls consistently since 2017, Republicans have a more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than they do of Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. They prefer Putin to Biden. Those are dangerous levels of polarization. Donald Trump is a symptom of that polarization. He did not cause it, and his departure from the White House probably will not end it. Now, the Trump administration threatens our democracy like no other administration in modern U.S. history. Trump has ordered the violent repression of peaceful protesters. He's condoned violent behavior among his supporters. He's trampled on congressional oversight. He's sought foreign intervention into our elections. But he's also, at a more fundamental, more mundane level, followed the basic playbook of elected autocrats in places like Russia, Turkey, Venezuela, and Hungary, in that he has corrupted key government agencies and deployed them for personal, for political, and ultimately for undemocratic ends. So across the United States government, officials who are responsible for law enforcement, for intelligence, for national defense, for election security, for public health, even for weather forecasting, have been under pressure to work for the president's personal and political benefit. And crucially, they are being pressured to deploy the power of government, to deploy the machinery of government against the president's critics and opponents. Those who refuse are often pushed out and replaced with Trump loyalists. That includes attorney generals, it includes FBI directors, it includes intelligence directors, it includes the various inspectors general whose job it is to serve as watchdogs against government abuse. This is how autocracies are built. Leaders turn agencies like the Justice Department and the FBI into political weapons. And they use those agencies then to shield themselves from investigation, to shield their allies from investigation, and to investigate and to punish critics. When the referees work for the government, the playing field, the political playing field, inevitably gets tilted, undermining democratic competition. That's what happened in Russia, it's what happened in Hungary, it's what happened in Turkey, it's what happened in Venezuela, and it's what the Trump administration is trying to do here. Now, when we wrote How Democracies Die in 2017, we expected, and wrote this, that a faction of the Republican Party would stand up to President Trump and serve as an obstacle to his abuse if he abused power. We were overly optimistic. Because of Trump's hold on the Republican base, Republicans who openly confronted him, who challenged him, people like Jeff Flake, saw their political careers essentially ruined. Unwilling, in almost every case, to risk their political career to defend democratic institutions, Republicans in Congress have essentially abdicated their responsibility to oversee the president, which has undermined Congress's role as a check on executive power. Think about last year's impeachment process. Senate Republicans made it clear from the very beginning that they would acquit the president no matter what the evidence of wrongdoing. In fact, they didn't even want to see the evidence of wrongdoing. That rendered the institution of impeachment useless, toothless, as a check on executive abuse. So democratic backsliding is no longer a matter of concerned speculation as it was when Ziblatt and I wrote our book. It's real. Global democracy indices like Freedom House, Varieties of Democracy, the Economist Intelligence Unit all show an erosion of American democracy since 2016. Not a collapse, but a modest erosion. So according to Freedom House, the United States is now in a category that is less democratic than Chile, that is less democratic than the Czech Republic, that is less democratic than Slovenia, Taiwan, and Uruguay. And in fact, it's in the same tier as newer democracies like Croatia, Greece, Mongolia, and Panama. So where are we headed? I want to lay out three potential threats. The first and the most immediate threat is continued democratic backsliding and a slide into some form of electoral autocracy, a slide into something like Hungary. We can't rule out that scenario, especially if Trump is reelected, but I think it's actually pretty unlikely. Despite what I just said, I think a slide into electoral autocracy remains pretty unlikely. Our democratic institutions continue to be a lot stronger than those in Russia and Hungary, in Turkey and Venezuela. The courts remain independent and quite powerful. Federalism is robust. and within every government agency that the White House has tried to corrupt, committed, professional, capable civil servants have pushed back vigorously. The civil servants don't always win in the end, but their resistance slows down the process of democratic erosion. So our institutions remain pretty robust. Another source of democratic resilience in the United States, another reason why we're probably not headed toward Putin's Russia, is the strength of the opposition. Whereas autocrats like Putin, Orban, Hugo Chavez steamrolled what was essentially a very weak opposition, the United States has a strong opposition. It's got a well-organized, well-financed, electorally viable opposition. That includes the Democratic Party, but it also includes a wide range of civic and activist groups like Black Lives Matter, which just spearheaded the largest wave of protest in U.S. history. A strong opposition makes it harder, not impossible, but harder to consolidate the kind of electoral autocracy that we see in places like Russia, Hungary, and Turkey. So I think even today, a slide into electoral autocracy is pretty unlikely. But I think two other threats to our democracy are more imminent, more likely, more serious. One is a slide not into autocracy, but into dysfunction. A functioning democracy, as I mentioned earlier, requires the existence of strong democratic norms. Our system, of a pretty elaborate system of constitutional checks and balances, only works if there is a minimal amount of mutual toleration and forbearance. But as I've argued, and as we argue in the book, those very norms are being eroded by polarization, and that is rendering our democracy increasingly, dangerously dysfunctional. When mutual toleration and forbearance disappear, divided government, pretty healthy notion that we all learned about in school, quickly descends into kind of a permanent institutional warfare. Politicians turn institutions into partisan weapons, and they exploit whatever legal authority is available to them to thwart their rivals. This is a world of stolen Supreme Court seats, of court packing, of partisan impeachments, of government shutdowns, of declarations of national emergency. A little over a year ago, Daniel and I had a meeting with a group of U.S. senators, and one of them, who briefly ran for the presidency, told us, quite frankly, this is a pretty moderate guy, that we will never again see a successful Supreme Court nomination when the president's party does not control the Senate. In other words, what he said is that Merrick Garland is about to become the rule rather than the exception. Or take impeachment, which I mentioned earlier. Donald Trump is exactly the kind of leader that impeachment was designed to protect us against. He exploits the power of his office for personal gain. He flouts congressional authority, the rule of law. He tried to use law enforcement agencies to investigate and to punish critics. And he sought to abuse the powers of the presidency to encourage foreign interference in the 2020 election. But our politics are so polarized that for Senate Republicans, beating the Democrats was more important than reining in that kind of executive abuse. In other words, polarization has rendered the institution of impeachment totally dysfunctional. That is a dangerous and a debilitating level of dysfunction. We're sliding into a world, no matter who wins the presidency in 2020, of constant institutional crisis, the world of government shutdowns, partisan impeachments, stolen Supreme Court seats, court packing, fabricated national emergencies, and maybe even contested elections. Remember Florida 2000? That may be nothing compared to what's coming. This slide into dysfunction has pretty important consequences. For one, most basically, it prevents our government from dealing with the most important problems facing our society. It prevents our government from dealing with major problems from pandemics to climate change to immigration to job losses. Secondly, dysfunction is, and more indirectly, dysfunction is eroding public confidence in democratic institutions. When governments consistently fail to respond to citizens' most pressing problems, when governments consistently fail to resolve basic problems, citizens eventually lose faith in the system. And that is happening in America today. According to a recent study, the percentage of Americans who say they are dissatisfied with our democracy has risen from less than 25% in the year 2000 to 55% today. Those are Latin American levels of dissatisfaction with democracy. When societies lose confidence that democracy can resolve their problems, they grow increasingly vulnerable to the appeals of demagogues who promise to get things done by other means. So the most imminent threat I think we face is a slide into dysfunction. The other threat, though, is a slide into minority rule. As all of you know, our electoral system favors sparsely populated territory. The Electoral College is slightly biased towards sparsely populated territories. The Senate is heavily biased towards sparsely populated territories. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominations, the Supreme Court is also somewhat biased towards sparsely populated territories. Now, for the first roughly 200 years of our history, that bias, always sucked for New York and was good for Wyoming, but it never had a partisan effect. It didn't matter politically because for 200 years, both of our major parties, or all of our major parties, had both urban and rural wings. It is only in the last generation, it's only in the last roughly 20 years that our parties have become deeply split along urban-rural lines. Today, the Democrats are overwhelmingly based in the big metropolitan centers, and the Republicans are overwhelmingly based in sparsely populated territories, small towns and rural areas. That means that, through no fault of their own, the Republicans have a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. And that opens up the possibility of minority rule. The last two Republican presidents won the White House, Bush in 2000, Trump in 2016, despite losing the popular vote. That could easily happen in 2020. If Trump wins, he'll win the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. The Democrats pretty overwhelmingly won the popular vote for the Senate nationally. The most votes for the Senate nationally in 2016 and in 2018, yet Republicans still solidly control the Senate. In 2017, Neil Gorsuch became the first Supreme Court justice in history to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote and then confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. A year later, Brett Kavanaugh became the second Supreme Court justice in our history to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote and then be confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. Now, Republicans did not create this counter-majoritarian system, but they may use it to further entrench themselves in power. We just saw an example of that with the Ukraine scandal. The president, again, abused his power, used the power of the presidency to try to undermine his rival in the 2020 election. But the Senate, a counter-majoritarian institution, let him get away with it. Another example, I'll get back to it in more detail in a second. Republicans across the country are engaged in efforts to disenfranchise low-income and minority voters by making it harder for people to register and to vote. Those efforts are being challenged in the courts, but so far the Supreme Court, another counter-majoritarian institution, has largely upheld those efforts and is likely to continue to do so. So we could be, for a while, headed for a period of what is essentially partisan minority rule, in which governments elected by a minority of Americans seek to tilt the playing field against the majority with the protection of two powerful counter-majoritarian institutions, the Senate and the Supreme Court. All right, so what can be done? First and foremost, most centrally, the Republican Party has to change. It has to become a more diverse political party. As long as the Republicans remain an overwhelmingly white Christian party in a society as diverse as ours, we will be prone, or it will be prone, to extremist and potentially even anti-democratic behavior. Why do I argue this? This is an important point. Democracy requires that political parties know how to lose. That means that when we lose an election, we accept defeat We go home, we get drunk, and we get up the next day to play again. In other words, both parties have to know how to lose graciously. For parties to lose graciously, two conditions must hold. First of all, parties have to believe that they stand a chance of winning again tomorrow. And secondly, parties have to believe that losing today will not bring ruinous consequences. When politicians fear that they're not going to be able to win future elections, or if they believe that defeat will bring catastrophe, the stakes suddenly rise dramatically. Politicians' time horizons shrink, they throw tomorrow to the wind, and they try to win at any cost today. In other words, desperation is what leads erstwhile Democratic politicians to play dirty. A couple examples. My co-author Daniel, who is the smart one of the two, found this dynamic in his research on late 19th century Germany. German conservatives in the second half of the 20th century were terrified by the prospect of universal suffrage. For them, giving the working class the right to vote meant not only the right's electoral demise, but the demise of the entire aristocratic order. So the conservatives played dirty. They used fraud and repression to hold on to power all the way through World War I. Closer to home, think about Southern Democrats after the Civil War. Reconstruction and the 15th Amendment brought widespread black enfranchisement across the U.S. South. African Americans constituted an outright majority, or a near majority in most Southern states. So their enfranchisement in the 1860s and 1870s scared the bejesus out of Southern Democrats and their backers. Not only did black suffrage threaten the Democratic Party's electoral dominance in the South, but it threatened to overturn the entire racial order. Facing what they perceived to be an existential threat, the Democrats played dirty. Between 1885 and 1908, all 11 post-Confederate states passed laws or constitutional changes that enabled the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, property requirements, and residency requirements to effectively eliminate African Americans' voting rights. So black turnout in the South fell from 61% in 1880 to 2% in 1912. Unwilling to lose, the Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population in the South, ushering it in almost a century of authoritarian rule in the U.S. South. We fear that something similar is happening to the Republican Party today. The Republicans' medium-term electoral prospects are pretty bleak. As I mentioned earlier, the Republicans are an overwhelmingly white Christian party, but white Christians are a declining portion of the American electorate. In 1992, when Bill Clinton was elected, not that long ago, white Christians were 73% of the electorate. By 2012, Obama's reelection, white Christians were down to 57% of the electorate. By 2024, they likely will be less than 50% of the electorate. To make matters worse, younger voters are overwhelmingly Democrats. In 2018, people aged 18 to 29 voted Democrat by a more than 2-to-1 margin. 30-somethings voted nearly 60% Democrat. And the notion that we become more conservative or more Republican as we get older is mostly a myth. Studies show that we tend to hold on to the partisan identities that we forged during our formative years. So if people are becoming Democrats now in their teens and 20s, they are likely to remain Democrats. But the problem is not just that Republicans face a bleak medium-term electoral future. It's that the Republican base has come to view defeat as catastrophic. As I noted earlier, many Republican voters fear that they're on the brink, not just of losing elections, but of losing their country. The very idea of a white Christian America seems to be slipping away. So slogans like "Take our country back" or "Make America great again" reflect that sense of peril and that sense of loss. So like the old Southern Democrats, Republicans have begun to play dirty. In state after state after state, Republican governments have taken steps to make it harder, particularly for lower income and minority voters, to register and to vote. closing polling places in predominantly African-American neighborhoods, purging voter rolls, making it harder to register. Since 2010, more than a dozen Republican states have adopted strict voter ID laws aimed at dampening turnout among poor and non-white voters. Georgia Republicans used egregious voter suppression tactics in the 2018 gubernatorial election, including a Jim Crow-style exact match law that allowed state officials to throw out any voter registration form whose information was not an exact match with other state records. So if my driver's license has Stephen R. Levitsky, and I forget to sign the R in my voter ID form, I technically can have my application thrown out. Last year, Texas Republicans tried to purge the voter rolls of nearly 100,000 Latinos because of their last name. And this year, they are now refusing to treat COVID-19 as a valid excuse to obtain an absentee ballot. So if I'm older and I'm fearful of voting because there happens to be a pandemic in Texas, which is possible, I can't use COVID-19 as an excuse to get an absentee ballot. So this is not just Trump. Republicans across the country are starting to play dirty. The only way out of this mess is for the Republicans to become a more diverse party. Once the Republicans learn or relearn how to compete for urban, secular, younger, non-white voters, they'll become more confident about winning elections, and they'll become less fearful of a multiracial America. When that happens, and I think it will happen, Republicans are very likely to de-radicalize, and our politics should begin to depolarize. When will that happen? It'll happen when Republicans lose elections. One thing we know about parties is that parties change when their strategies fail. So Republicans are likely to change course when they receive a series of electoral shellackings. So the question is, what should Democrats do in the meantime? Democrats with a big D this time. Well, an idea that's gained traction in progressive circles over the last 3 or 4 years is that Democrats themselves need to start playing dirty. Republicans are going to continue to play constitutional hardball. The argument goes, then Democrats must play tit for tat, using forbearance, while the other guy is playing hardball. It's like going into a boxing ring with a hand tied behind your back. So the argument goes that Democrats need to learn to fight like Republicans, to do things like shut down the government and pack the court and steal Supreme Court seats. In fact, there's a movement to pack the Supreme Court the next time the Democrats win both the presidency and the Senate. We think that would be a terrible mistake. A tit-for-tat strategy would inevitably lead to escalation, which would only accelerate the politicization of our institutions and accelerate the erosion of our democratic norm. Once that spiral of escalating constitutional hardball begins, it becomes very difficult to reverse. It becomes very difficult to stop that train. You look at other countries, from Spain in the 1930s, to Chile in the 1970s, to Turkey and Venezuela in the early 2000s. That kind of escalation rarely ends well. That movie almost never ends well. Keep in mind, if you're a Democrat, the Democrats' medium-term prospects are much better than Republicans. Their electorate is younger, their electorate is growing. The greatest threat to the Democratic Party's medium-term prospects is an escalating conflict that puts our institutions at risk, one that either destroys our democracy or, more likely, leaves our democracy utterly dysfunctional. If Democrats start to fight like Republicans, they will be hurling themselves down that very path. What Democrats can do is fight for democratic reform. The best way to combat minority rule is to double down on democracy, to defend and to expand the right to vote. That means pushing for measures that make it easier for people to register and vote. Automatic registration, easier access to polling places, make Election Day a holiday, fully restore the Voting Rights Act, and during this pandemic, provide all Americans with an unassailable option of voting by mail. Again, the best way to defend democracy is to ensure that everybody has the ability to vote. The United States is in the middle of an immense political earthquake. I think it's a political earthquake that most of us did not see coming. We've begun a transition that, to my knowledge, no democracy has ever successfully undergone. We're undergoing a transition in which a previously dominant ethnic group loses its majority status. I actually think I'm pretty confident that we'll be the first democracy to successfully make that transition, that we will get to the other side. But to get there, we're going to inevitably have to pass through a period of intense and polarizing reaction. That's where we are right now. During that period of intense and polarizing reaction, Americans cannot afford to be reckless with our institutions. We have far to lose. That's all I got.
Thank you.
I've unmuted everybody, I hope.
Oh, that's scary.
Okay. A lot to think about.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to make any kind of a comment or
Did anybody hear this guy before we decided?
raise your hand, please?
Somebody was talking, they stopped.
If anybody has a comment, please. Stu, go ahead.
I didn't quite catch the intro. What is this guy? What's his qualifications, his credentials to make this talk? You know?
He's a professor at Harvard.
At Harvard?
Yep.
And professor of what?
I can't remember. It's probably political science or something.
Smart guy. Okay, smart guy at Harvard.
Yeah.
It depends. If you went to Yale or Stanford, you may disagree with that. But,
No, if you went to Yale or Stanford or Harvard, it's all the same ilk.
yeah, but they don't think the other one's smart, you know.
Okay. All right. Well, gives us something to think about. My only comment is, unfortunately, I think, when he talked about the Democratic and Republicans of the 50s and 60s, now I think we've gone, the Democrats are too far to the left and the Republicans are too far to the right. So there's going to be that conflict, whereas years ago, other than some, ways and means issues, they're pretty much, we're aligned in thinking. So get rid of the radicals on both sides, and I think it might be a solution.
That's the polarization.
Bill Flannery.
Mute, Bill. You're on mute.
Bill, you're muted.
Still mute, Bill.
Unmute yourself, Bill.
There you go.
Okay. Listening to him, he seemed to be concentrating on the executive branch and on the court system. He didn't talk a whole lot about the legislative branch. And it seems to me that the legislative branch, that is our Senate and our House of Representatives, have been very lax in not passing laws where they're needed. Take immigration, for example. For a long, long time, we've had this immigration issue that needs to be debated and resolved some way or other, and that falls in the legislative branch. But because they haven't been able to do anything, well, the president has taken executive action again and again, and then it's been overturned by the courts, and we go around in this circle. But I think it's the legislative branch that is letting us down.
I think didn't we have a speaker at one point that brought that up, is that the legislative branch has abdicated their willingness to legislate and create laws, and they're leaving it up to, let's call it the administrative branch of government, the various departments to make the laws. So, and when you get that, you know, then you have a problem. I mean, they've just given up on, you know, either too lazy or incompetent to make the laws, and they're leaving it to the administrative branch. And that's not anything that's recent. It's been going on for a number of years now. And yeah, you're right, Bill. The legislative has not done their job and is not doing their job.
I think it goes back to something that he said, is that they don't talk to one another.
I don't know if it's a question of talking to one another or just, you know, to put it mildly, they don't have the balls to make the laws, because if they go in and make a law that is not popular, they're not going to get voted. All they're concerned about is getting reelected again, so they're not going to stick their necks out. I mean, that I think is pretty simple. You can see. See
I don't
that.
know whether, yeah, I don't know how many people remember we had Senator Hines speak to us a number of years ago. And I always remember the one thing he said was, the first time he got elected, after he got elected, he suddenly realized that he immediately had to start running for re-election. You know, and that was their priority, you know,
Representative.
to start running for re-election.
Is that John Gawanter?
No, that's me.
Lloyd.
Unfortunately, my house battery went dead, so I can't use my computer. So I'm using my wife's laptop. And so I think he presented a very serious argument where we're drifting towards an autocracy type of government, where one party will control the entire apparatus of government. And I thought he made another great comment, that he felt that the Senate and the Supreme Court, but the Senate approves the Supreme Court nominee. So in effect, it's really the Senate. He who controls the Senate apparently controls the government to a great extent, because if the one-party system controls the Senate, the House is given Democratic, and a Democratic president, I think you're going to see a major transformation of the country drifting towards a one-party system. And this is very frightening, because liberties will disappear. That you have to conform to the governing party's dictates. This is the kind of thing that takes place over a long time. Well, probably not in my lifetime will I see this, but I think it's a very frightening prospect.
We lose the electoral college, it can happen in 1 week.
All right, before we sign off, next week, maybe Joe D.
Yeah.
You think you might want to head up a current events?
Yeah. I'll do it. Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, so Steve, I might not be able to join next week. Carol's got a doctor's appointment that's conflicting, so.
We'll just hold the discussion during the regular meeting time versus early.
No, it's our regular, there's no other meetings from now on, you know, till the end of August. 10 to 11 is what we do.
I just wanted to say it so everybody realized.
Yeah, no, 10 to 11 is our meeting time. Bob Loop and coming in at 11. You're muted, Bob.
Sorry about that, Joe. I have been out without power. We did get it back finally, so I decided I should sign in.
We decided that was no excuse earlier. You have a cell phone.
I know.
I got no power.
Right.
That's one advantage of living next to the Superior Court building and the police station. You're almost guaranteed to have power all the time.
Okay, guys. like I said, there should be, it was advertised on the newsletter or the mayor's office newsletter that there's a mask giveaway going on right now at Rippewam, and I'm gonna try and head over, and hopefully they're doing it. Meanwhile, stay well, stay healthy, stay safe, and stay out of trouble, guys. God bless.
Take care.
See everybody next week.
Bye.
Carol.